Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. The French Revolution was one of the most influential events in modern human history. Today, let's talk about the causes, events, and consequences of the revolution, all while learning some useful English vocabulary. You can find the full transcript of today's episode over on the Thinking in English blog. Head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more content, and leave a like, rating, or review wherever you are listening right now. Here is today's vocabulary list. As always, the written list is available in the description of the podcast or on my blog, thinkinginenglish.blog. Revolution. Revolution. A change in the way a country is governed, usually to a different political system and often using violence or war. For example, the country seems to be heading towards revolution. Republic. Republic. A country without a king or queen, usually governed by elected representatives and a president, such as San Marino in Europe is considered the oldest republic in the world. Noble. Noble. Belonging to a high social rank in society, especially by birth, as in, he was born into a famous noble family. To culminate. To culminate. If an event or series of events culminates in something, it ends with it, having developed until it reaches this point. As in, their many years of research have finally culminated in a cure for the disease. The Enlightenment. The Enlightenment. The period in the 18th century in Europe when many people began to emphasize the importance of science and reason. For example, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the greatest Enlightenment thinkers. Treason. Treason. The crime of showing no loyalty to your country. For example, in 1606, Guy Fawkes was executed for treason. Feudalism. Feudalism. The social and land-owning system of Western Europe in the Middle Ages, in which people served noble families and in exchange were supported and given land. For instance, capitalism replaced feudalism in Western Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. Fraternity. Fraternity. A feeling of friendship and support. For example, the Olympics have become a way to promote fraternity between nations. I often think back to when I was an 18-year-old undergraduate student, taking history and politics classes at the University of Nottingham. Higher education introduced me to a whole new world of topics. I studied nuclear weapons in my international security class, the Norman kings of England in my medieval history classes, and the ideas of Foucault, Marx, and Hannah Arendt in political philosophy lectures. Throughout the years I have studied history and politics, it has become clear that a few special events in history have had incredible, widespread, and transformative effects. For example, Constantine the Great's conversion to Christianity, the first Roman emperor to do so. The invention of the printing press, which allowed books to be printed relatively quickly. The Russian Revolution of 1917. Events like this influenced and changed the course of history. They changed the way people live act, and think. The French Revolution was arguably the most important event in modern history. In fact, at my university, modern history was considered to start at the French Revolution. It is hard to express the true importance of the French Revolution. Within France, it transformed the country into a republic and introduced new rights. And around the world, the French Revolution triggered the beginnings of liberal democracy, reduced the importance of religion, developed ideas of nationalism, inspired revolutions, and much more. Today, I want to talk about this significant event. Let's discuss the causes of the French Revolution, the main events of the revolution, and some of the major consequences around the world. As with most European countries in the 18th century, France was a monarchy controlled by a king, Louis XVI. King Louis XVI became King of France in 1774, at the age of 20, and was part of the Bourbon dynasty of rulers, which spread from France to Spain, Naples, Sicily, and Luxembourg. While Louis was said to be a bright but shy child, he was immature and unprepared for the throne. In fact, his advisors and tutors taught him that being austere was a great character for a king. And as a result, Louis was often indecisive. He couldn't make a decision. France was struggling economically. They had spent a lot supporting the Americans in their war of independence from Britain. Rather than raising taxes to do this, King Louis decided to take out international loans to support the Americans and fund his other policies. France's national debt was incredibly high, and years of drought, poor harvests, and high bread prices spread discontent throughout the country. In 1786, the king and his advisors finally decided on a series of financial reforms, including a new tax that would apply to all citizens, including the aristocracy and noble families. To get support for these policies, King Louis summoned the Estates General for the first time since 1614. The Estates General was an assembly, a meeting, representing the three estates of France: the clergy, so the religious leaders, the nobility, and the middle classes. The meeting was set for May 5th, 1789, and representatives were sent to gather the opinions of each group. However, France had changed a lot since the previous meeting of the Estates General in 1614. The middle classes were now 98% of the population, but they would only get 33% of votes during the meeting. And the noble families would be able to veto any policy they didn't like. Known as the Third Estate, this middle-class group wanted to reform the entire voting system and introduce financial and political reforms. By the time of the Estates General meeting, the three groups were openly hostile to each other, and the Third Estate had given themselves the title National Assembly. The Third Estate also made the tennis court oath, so called because they were meeting on a tennis court, and they promised they would not leave the meetings until they had achieved their goals of a new constitution. On June 12th, violence broke out in Paris. Parisians were not happy that there was rumours of a military coup. They were happy that the royal family's influence was being challenged, but the military coup scared people. The violence culminated on July 14th, when the Bastille fortress was stormed by protesters trying to get weapons and gunpowder. The revolutionary feeling was now being experienced across the whole country. French peasants looted and burned the houses of local nobles and landlords. The Great Fear, as it became known, pushed the French nobles to flee the country. They were terrified of attacks by the French peasantry. On August 4th, 1789, feudalism was officially abolished in France. Feudalism was the old economic system which tied peasants to landowners. In August 1789, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted in France. This document was full of democratic ideas, and ideas inspired by great Enlightenment thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. France's old system of nobility and aristocracy was to be replaced with a new system, and this system would be based on ideas including freedom of speech, representative government, and the right to vote. It took 2 years to write the formal constitution of France, and the National Assembly struggled with difficult problems. What would the new government look like? What to do about the Catholic Church? What role would be given to the king and the royal family? A moderate constitution was made and adopted on September 3rd, 1791. And this was France's first ever written constitution, and turned France into a constitutional monarchy. However, the fact that the king would still be able to appoint government officials and veto decisions frustrated more radical French people, like Maximilien de Robespierre. Robespierre founded the extremist group known as the Jacobins, who arrested the king on August 10th, 1792. Hundreds of people, assumed to be counter-revolutionary, so against the French Revolution, were killed by protesters, and the movement openly supported France to become a republic, and for the monarchy to be abolished. On January 21st, 1793, King Louis XVI was sentenced to death for high treason. He was executed by guillotine, and his wife, Marie Antoinette, was executed by the same method later in the year. After the execution of the king, France entered what was known as the Reign of Terror. Robespierre and the Jacobins created a new calendar, abolished Christianity, and killed thousands of their enemies. Over 17,000 people were executed during the Reign of Terror. Robespierre himself was executed in 1794, and a more moderate group came to lead France. After more years of financial crises and inefficiency, the French Revolution ended with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, a military leader who ushered in France's Napoleonic era. So, the French Revolution was a violent and erratic attempt to create a new society. And although it ended with the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, the revolution has had major consequences that continue to influence society today. One of the most obvious consequences is that the revolution ended France's centuries of monarchy. The House of Bourbon had ruled France for 400 years, but was replaced with a republican form of government. The Royal Guard was also replaced with a National Guard. Although the Bourbon family did take control of France again for a few years in the 19th century, the revolution established the idea of republicanism in France. France's economic system was also radically changed. Under the system of feudalism, French peasants were basically tied to and dependent on the noble family who owned their land. They had to pay large taxes to landowners and churches, but the French Revolution removed these. France became a land of small and independent farms after feudalism, and land was distributed. For centuries, the Catholic Church had had a very powerful role in France. It was the national religion, owned 10% of the land, and received 10% of people's income as a form of tax known as a tithe. The French Revolution almost destroyed the church. Priests and nuns were executed, the church's land was taken over by the government, and the taxes were abolished. While Napoleon did reintroduce the church in the early 19th century, the power and land of the Catholic Church was never returned. Outside of France, the revolution has also had consequences. Belgium, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and parts of modern-day Germany were invaded by the armies of the French Revolution. The French were frustrated that these countries were protecting the old French aristocracy who fled the country years earlier. The parts of Europe that were taken over by the French actually went on to experience higher levels of growth and development. The revolution had destroyed the old systems that protected nobility and religious officials. And nobility and religious officials are groups that often oppose change and innovation. So, in places touched by the revolution, the barriers to innovation decreased, allowing for economic change and development. The French Revolution also inspired revolutions in other places. One of the most famous examples was the Haitian Revolution. News of the French Revolution inspired the slaves of Haiti, at the time a French colony, to revolt and take over the land. After years of war, the Haitian Revolution ended in Haiti's independence in 1804. In fact, the revolution was the only instance of slaves revolting and founding a country ruled by the former captives. Other revolutions that were also directly or indirectly inspired by the French Revolution include the Irish Rebellion of 1798, the Sicilian Revolution of 1848, the First Italian War of Independence, the independence movements in Latin America, and the 1848 Revolution in Italy. The problems in France were not unique, and they affected other countries around the world. And all of those revolutions were in some way influenced. Perhaps the most important and long-term consequence of the French Revolution was its consequences on the history of ideas. In fact, the term ideology was first used during the French Revolution. Ideologies are sets of ideas and perspectives on the way to organize social and political life, and they were born out of the French Revolution. Monarchy was no longer accepted as the only form of government, and people had different ideas on how to organize their societies. Even within France, there was a great deal of different opinions and ideas. I've talked about nationalism before in earlier episodes, but did you know that modern nationalism developed from the ideas of the French Revolution? Nationalism is an ideology that promotes loyalty and love of one's country. The French Revolution turned France into one of the first modern nation-states in Europe, a country where the people were loyal to the nation instead of the king. This ideology was spread around Europe, and nationalism has become a major political theme, even today. The French Revolution had the slogan "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." The aristocracy was overthrown, and all men were given the democratic right to vote. This is the base of the ideology of liberalism. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which I mentioned earlier, is considered one of the foundational documents of liberalism. And while the ideologies of communism and socialism became prominent around a century after the French Revolution, these ideologies were developed in the intellectual environment created by the French Revolution. So here is today's final thought. The French Revolution was one of the most important events in modern history. It ended the reign of France's royal family, it changed the economic system in France, it inspired revolutions around the world, and it gave birth to some of the most influential ideas and ideologies of the 20th century. Considering the importance of this event, I thought it would be useful and interesting to introduce and discuss the history of the French Revolution. What do you think? What do you think is the most important consequence of the French Revolution? What are some other incredibly influential historical events? Let me know in the comments on the Thinking in English blog, the comments on Spotify, or send me a message on Instagram. Talking of Instagram, make sure you're following me over there, Thinking in English podcast. It's one of the best ways to communicate with me, and I also post different reels and posts giving information about news and language history. And quite often I put things from my personal life as well. For example, when I go for a walk, I take a picture of the nice scenery. So if you'd like to see what it's like to be Tom in Tokyo, you can have a look at Thinking in English podcast. And if you love listening to Thinking in English, please consider subscribing to the Patreon, Thinking in English Patreon. It's the best way to support Thinking in English. By far the best way. You're helping me to pay for blog fees, pay for new equipment to record better podcasts, to pay for editing software, subscriptions to different magazines and services and design software. It's not free to run a podcast, but for the first 2 years, I didn't make any money doing it. And now the Patreon offers a way for you to help support me. And in return, you can have conversation clubs every Tuesday. We do them at 12 p.m. UK time and 6 p.m. UK time, which is 8 p.m. Japan time and 2 a.m. Japan time on Tuesdays, right? So you have to work out your own time zones, but there should be a time for most people. You also can have bonus podcast episodes. If you sign up today, there are 10 bonus podcast episodes for you to listen to right now. And one-on-one conversations with myself. And in the future, discounted English lessons with myself and some of the other Thinking in English, some of my friends who help with Thinking in English as well. So please consider supporting me on Patreon. But if you don't have the money, don't worry. All you need to do is leave a like, a review, or a rating wherever you are listening right now, and that is probably the best way, the second best way to support me, because I want to be the most liked, the most followed English learner podcast in the world. Because I'm not a big company. I'm not the BBC or the British Council. I'm just Tom, who sits in his very small bedroom in Tokyo and records these by himself. So I hope you all have a good evening, and I'll see you next time.